Hello and welcome to a really special show with somebody who's really special to all of us. Vinton Cerf, the man who's been often described along with Bob Kahn as the father of the internet. Are you proud of that paternity, by the way, before I move on?
Well, I've learned something. I have two sons, and one thing I learned was don't take too much credit when they do well, because if they don't do well, you don't want to take too much blame. So I would like to point out that although Bob Kahn and I did the original design work, and I have been pursuing internet ever since, a lot of other people had to be committed to make this thing happen. So, I'm just glad that I got to be around to start this off.
All right, well, we are going to call you, Vint, as the father of the internet out here. So it's great to have you with us. You're also, of course, VP Google Chief Internet Evangelist, which is a lovely title to have, which I do want to ask you about. I mean, it's a great title to have. And we do have out here a large audience filled with young people. As you know, the median age in India is 24, so we've got that median age at approximately.
This is India? Wow.
Yes,
okay.
Right out here. You know, before I proceed with Vint, I just want to do some unscientific snap polling out here. How many of you feel that the internet is more important for you than television is? Wow. Wow. Is there anybody who doesn't feel that way? Okay. Related question. How many of you think the internet is more important to you than your mobile phone is?
Right. Yeah.
No, that surprises me. That surprises me actually even more. So, all right, fine.
Well, wait a minute. So, the mobile phone is the internet if you have a smartphone, right?
Theoretically.
So, I mean, there we go. Right?
Theoretically, yes. But, you know, talking, texting, you can sometimes do that without the internet.
Okay.
All right. So now you can see what you started off. You can see the sort of an impact you made on people's lives. How did you start by working on those protocols that eventually became the internet?
In the 1960s, ideas came about for interconnecting computers over networks, and those ideas were different than the way the telephone system works. The telephone system uses what's called circuit switching. It sets up a path and it stays up until somebody hangs up. The packet switched world is more like electronic postcards. The computer generates a piece of data and it flings it into the net, just like the postal service, except 100 million times faster. And the consequence of this idea was that you could get machines talking to each other and could speak to many different computers all at the same time by sending packets out to each of them whenever there was a piece of data to go. So we were excited about that technology. The U.S. Defense Department funded the implementation of a network they called the ARPANET. The agency that funded it was the Advanced Research Projects Agency, so we named it after them. And the question was, can we make this work on a national scale? So we built that network, we operated it starting in 1969, and it was quite successful. At this point, my partner, Bob Kahn, came to my lab at Stanford University, and he said, we have a problem. I said, what's the problem? He said, well, we've demonstrated packet switching on wireline networks connecting these computers to each other over dedicated telephone circuits, but we would like to be able to use this in mobile operation, which means we need radio, ground radio, and we also want it to work in ships at sea, which means we need satellites to connect ships that are very far apart. So we began developing a packet satellite and a packet radio network. Then we asked ourselves, how are we going to connect these things to each other? That was the internet problem, because we were linking nets to each other. During the 6-month period, from March of 1973 to September of 73, we explored the possible design of that system. We finished the first paper in September of 1973. It was revised and published in May of 1974. First paper describing what the internet could be and how it would work. We didn't even call it the internet. We called it a protocol for packet network intercommunication. By December of 74, we were calling this thing internet. On January 1, 1983, we turned the internet on with 3 or 4 different kinds of networks in operation: mobile packet radio, packet satellite, the ARPANET, and Ethernet coming out of Xerox PARC. That's January 1, 1983. So the network has been in operation for 30 years, believe it or not. By 10 years later, Tim Berners-Lee invents the World Wide Web, and nobody notices until a couple of researchers at the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, Mark Andreessen and Eric Bina, develop a browser they call Mosaic. This is a graphical browser, one that you can mix images and text together. They released that, and about 1 million people downloaded that software in actually 1992 or 93 or so. Then a company called Netscape Communications is formed and hires Eric Bina and Mark Andreessen to make a commercial version. And at this point, when they release the commercial versions, the rest of the world wakes up, notices this, and the dot boom is on.
So when you were working on this, I mean, I'm sure you didn't anticipate what it would eventually become, or did you at that stage?
Well, you know, the honest truth is that some of this we did anticipate, and I can give you a few examples, but not everything. I mean, how can you possibly imagine what will happen when you connect 2 or 3 billion people together sharing information with each other? There was a man named Douglas Engelbart who was funded also by ARPA in the early 1960s, and he had this idea, which was shared by some of the leadership at ARPA, that computers could be used for something besides computation. It could be used for communication and collaboration. So he built a system at SRI International in Menlo Park, California, on a single computer that he called the online system. It allowed you to create text documents, share them with each other, point to other text documents using hyperlinks, and oh, by the way, he invented the mouse that lets you point to places in the text and interact with it or click on it to go to another document. He built what in effect was a World Wide Web inside of one box. That was available to us. We saw that going on at when we were doing the ARPANET program. Xerox Palo Alto Research Center is 1.5 miles from my laboratory at Stanford University. They're inventing the Ethernet in 1973. They're building personal computers at the cost of $50,000 each called the Alto machine, which they've now connected on this 3 megabit Ethernet. Those guys were living in 1972, 20 years in the future. We saw that too. We had a very clear sense of how powerful this stuff could be. But in 1988, I suddenly realized that this is not going to reach the general public unless it's turned into an economic engine that's self-supporting, because up until that time, only U.S. government-funded agencies and organizations were allowed to get access to it. So if you're a university with a Defense Department contract or from the National Science Foundation, you could get on the net, but not the general public. So when I realized that we needed to do something to make it commercially viable, I started lobbying the American government to connect up a commercial system called MCI Mail, a commercial email service that I had designed for MCI, to the internet. Now, I was trying to break this barrier that said you can't put commercial traffic on the government backbone. And I thought, well, if they'll let me do this little experiment, that means I'll be putting commercial traffic on the backbone. It will break that policy. And they let me do that. And as soon as we announced that we made this interconnection, all the other commercial email services said, wait a minute, they can't be the only ones that get access to this. So they all got connected on the internet. And what's interesting about that is that before, all of these email services had been completely separate from each other. You couldn't talk across them. But because they'd all been connected on the internet, they suddenly discovered they were interconnected to each other. It was a big surprise.
One of the factors which I'm not sure you were able to actually factor into your calculations at that time, although Moore's law was already, in a sense, in existence, the amount of processing power that you had in your lab is probably way less than the average person would have in their wristwatch.
That's exactly right.
That's a supercomputer. But I'm saying even on a wristwatch,
yes.
The average wristwatch today would probably have a digital wristwatch would have more computing power than the biggest computers at that time. And number two was bandwidth. I'm sure that thinking about terabytes of data being streamed back and forth is something which would have been
by a factor of 1 million. All of these numbers got bigger by a factor of 1 million over the 20 or 30 years of the internet's existence.
So that would have been one of the factors that I guess has that taken you by surprise? You know, YouTube and the amount of video that is going around.
So honestly, no. And let me explain why. In the mid-1970s. Remember, this is supported by the Defense Department, and so we're thinking, okay, what do they want to do with this kind of technology? Well, they need to talk to each other. It would be good if they had video capability. So we designed and built packet voice and packet video in the late 70s and early 80s. It's just that the backbone speeds were not very fast, and so it was only 50,000 bits per second, which is what you get with a modem, dial-up modem today, but that was backbone speeds. So although we couldn't do very much of this stuff, we were doing it. So the fact that, the idea that you could do video was not new.
So people communicating on Facebook,
right,
and then of course e-commerce, transactions increasingly happening online.
Yes.
What were the major factors that you think led to that happening?
So on the e-commerce side, there was a great appetite for this even in the 1980s. The term e-commerce was coined somewhere around that time. And the belief was that it would be easier for people to carry out transactions electronically than having to go to a brick and mortar store if you could in fact see what the merchandise was available. And in fact, the thinking was a virtual store could have more inventory in it than any physical store could. Imagine the number of books that were available at Amazon or the number of music tunes that are available on Apple iTunes. If you tried to put all of that in a physical store and then replicate the stores in order to meet the market, you probably couldn't afford to do it. Too expensive. So this online environment with its inexpensive digital storage made a huge difference.
And the Facebook phenomenon?
So Facebook is an interesting phenomenon because that was an example of social networking that really took off. There were earlier examples, MySpace for instance, and a few others. But in a very funny way, it wasn't a surprise to us that social phenomena would be indigenous to the internet, and I'll explain why. After the ARPANET was built, not even before the internet, the ARPANET was built, we turned it on in 1969. 2 years later, in 1971, somebody figures out how to do network electronic mail. That was a man from a company called Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, and Ray Tomlinson. So as soon as electronic mail was shown to the rest of us in this research community, everyone instantly recognized how useful this would be. So the thing is that what happened after email was introduced, we all got very excited about it, distribution lists were created within a couple of weeks. One of them was called Sci-Fi Lovers, because look, we're all geeks and we all read science fiction, so this was a distribution list talking about recent and maybe even older science fiction stories, which ones were good or bad or had stupid ideas. Not very long after that, another distribution list gets created called Yum Yum. It was a restaurant evaluation in Palo Alto, where I was at Stanford University. I didn't start either of those two distribution lists, but it was instantly clear that this medium would allow these kinds of social interactions to happen. The Facebook phenomenon it exploited the fact that we had enough bandwidth and storage to put imagery in place, and that was pretty clear because the World Wide Web by this time was quite mature. So all of this is not surprising, it's just that it manifests in a richer and richer way. I don't know what comes next, but I can tell you whatever it is, it will probably be even more interesting when it's holographics and 3D imagery and things like that.
One of the other things that I think really happened, which kick-started all of this, and I know you're now with Google as chief internet evangelist, was really search. And once that started happening and you could Google anything and go out and find it and be able to locate information, that in a sense was also one of, I think, the really critical turning points, because suddenly human knowledge, which was something, and which was it had so many gatekeepers before it, is available to anybody. Anybody with a search engine can go and find information.
But imagine that literally everything that there is to know about the world, the universe, economics, mathematics, and all the other subjects is available to anyone at their fingertips whenever they want it.
Isn't that the case already? I thought we were getting there very fast.
Well, there's still a lot of information locked up in these things called books that are in libraries that haven't yet been digitized, and it makes them harder to search. I don't know if you have books at home. I sometimes stand in front of my library, which has a lot of books, thinking, I know that there is some information in one of the books here, but I don't remember which one, and I wish that all of these books were digitized so I could find it. I don't mind taking the book out then, reading it, but finding it was the problem. That's why we're working on digitizing a lot of books at Google. So this whole question of all the information being available at any time is almost an all-consuming objective. We would have to be an incredibly stupid species not to want to make that happen, not to make information available whenever somebody needed it. And that's an objective worth pursuing. I need to tell you something about this title, though. Chief Internet Evangelist. I didn't actually ask for that title. When they invited me to come and work at Google, they said, "What title do you want?" And I said, "How about Archduke?" That sounded like a pretty good title. And they said, "Well, it doesn't fit in our, HR nomenclature. How about Chief Internet Evangelist, considering that's kind of what you've been doing for the last 35 years. So I said, it's a wonderful title, I'll take it. However, it is misunderstood sometimes. And when I was lecturing in Moscow, I was asked 4 times in public after my lectures, "Do you believe in God?" And I thought, wow, that's a pretty personal question to ask. So I thought about it for a little bit, and I said, well, I'm Geek Orthodox. And that worked okay.
Geek Orthodox. I love it. I love it.
That's okay. All right.
That's actually quite fascinating. All right, we are going to now start diving towards the future.
Okay.
And looking at